Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everybody, wherever you may be in the world. We're really glad to have you here with us at Parrot Analytics Live. Today, we're once again going to look at our quarterly global television demand report. And a special welcome to our Demand 360 Lite customers and, of course, our Demand 360 Enterprise customers as well. We've received a couple of really, well, actually quite a few insightful questions when you sign up for the webinar. So thank you so much for submitting those. And we'll make sure that we get to at least some of the best of those throughout the session, or at least at the end. And if you've got any questions as we present, we would really love it if you actually submit those in the chat. So this is an interactive webinar. I'll be looking very closely what people are asking. And so we're looking really forward to answering those as we go with the session. And once again, if we've got time at the end, we'll get to those at the end of the session. So I'll just hang tight. We'll just sit right here for a little bit, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we'll get underway. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Parrot Analytics, and it's with great pleasure today that we will talk to you once again about our quarterly global television demand report. Just to note, this report is being produced every quarter and is offered exclusively for Demand 360 Lite customers. And we'd love to see you again at the next session. We do a Parrot Analytics Live webinar every month. And so every third session or so will be this report. So we love having all of you here. Without further ado, I'd like to now hand over to our Senior Insights Analyst, Chris. Take it away.
Thanks for kicking off, Samuel. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. I'm really excited to be sharing our latest report with you all again. And I'm sure many of you have seen our quarterly reports before, so you know how much information we pack into these. This latest one is 70 pages, looks at 11 different markets around the world. And because of that, because there's so much to cover, today's webinar is going to be focused on some of the most important insights, as well as some of my personal favorite findings, which I hope you find interesting as well. So just a reminder, this report covers demand for digital original series in Q2 of this year. That's globally and in these 11 specific markets. Now, why do we focus on digital originals? I think this boils down to 2 points. So with these series especially, there's a lack of good data on how they perform. It's usually the case that viewership numbers are a closely guarded secret, and when they're shared, it's not shared for every show generally. And because of that, we really think that by focusing on these shows, we can shine some light on them for the industry. Second, there is a key business reason that these shows are important. We know that highly in-demand original content, often exclusive to its own platform, is what's driving people to sign up to these services. So because of that, that's why we're focusing on these shows in this report. So let's get into it. All right, so starting with some global takeaways. It's always nice to have a high-level global view of what's going on before we get into the market-specific trends. And here you can see the 11 markets we cover in this report. A nice geographic spread. We always try to do that in these, make sure we're giving some attention to all markets. And if you've been following them, you'll know that we mix it up every quarter. So the markets we're covering this quarter likely won't be the same next quarter, and so on and so forth. So to begin with, we're looking at the most in-demand digital original shows by market. So for starters, we have the US, Spain, and Russia. In these 3 markets, Stranger Things was the most in-demand digital original series for Q2. Now we've seen that Stranger Things consistently outperforms in its home market, the US. And with Spain and Russia, these 2 markets in particular, you'll see in the report, they're drama lovers. They love all types of drama content, including sci-fi drama, which is what Stranger Things is. And this is very impressive given that Stranger Things hasn't released any new seasons in quite a while, still manages to be consistently at the top of the rankings. So that shows how much of a global hit it is. Next, we have Falcon and the Winter Soldier from Disney Plus, and that was the most in-demand digital original in 3 markets in this report: Germany, the UAE, and Australia. And also from Disney Plus, we have WandaVision topping the rankings in Singapore and Peru. Now, I just wanted to pause for a minute and reflect on how this map in Q2 looks different from how it did in Q1. So if you recall, in Q1, WandaVision was the most in-demand digital original series in 8 of the 10 markets we were looking at then. So pretty dominant. And here we see between WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier, they top the rankings in 5 of the 11 markets. So Disney Plus not quite as dominant this quarter as it was in Q1 when it really started kicking things off. Next, we have Handmaid's Tale. Of course, it released its season 4 in Q2. It was at the top of the rankings in the 2 Nordic markets we're looking at in this report, Norway and Finland. I'm not entirely sure what makes it so popular in the Nordic areas. If anyone has any ideas, feel free to share in the chat. I don't know if anyone has any insider information, but we definitely see some regional preference here with The Handmaid's Tale. And finally, totally unique to Japan, Fishers and the Lost Treasure, that's from YouTube. That was the most in-demand digital original series in Japan for the quarter. So if those were the most in-demand original series in each market, this chart's looking at how demand for all digital original series globally rolls up to those series original platforms. So no surprise, Netflix has the largest share of demand for original series, 48.3%. But it is notable that this is the first quarter that Netflix has fallen below a 50% share of demand globally. So we really see its demand share being chipped away at. Now we also see newer platforms like Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, HBO Max. Maybe not brand new anymore, but still the new kids on the block, I would say. They're continuing to grow their demand share. So Disney Plus, its global demand share is up from 6% Q1 to 7.3% here. Apple TV Plus went from 4.7% in Q1 to 5.4%, and HBO Max 4.1% to 4.8%. So there's still room to grow for these newer streamers. It is also important to call out that Amazon Prime Video was actually able to grow its global demand share this quarter from 12.2% to 12.7%. That's impressive, given that it's facing increased competition from these new players. It is one of the more established streamers, has a larger demand share. So the fact that it's still able to grow its demand share is impressive. Now, we focus on demand share quite a lot, and it's really a convenient way to look at things that shows the relative standing of these platforms and their originals. You can see who's gaining at whose expense, but it isn't the entire story. It's really one part of the story. And what we have here, this is looking at total global demand for Netflix originals. And you can see it's been growing pretty consistently over time, over the past 2 years here. So what does that mean? This means that Netflix is still growing total demand for all of its original series consistently over the past 2 years. And we see its demand share being chipped away at because total demand for original series from all other platforms is growing much more quickly. That's because there's simply more series coming from these platforms. There are more platforms entering the market, period. So really increased competitive pressure is what's chipping away at Netflix's demand share. So I think the takeaway is that the digital original pie is still growing, even if Netflix's slice is shrinking. So that's just something to keep in mind as we're looking at these demand shares. And one of the things we do in this report, we don't just look at top-level global all shows. We drill into specific genres and see what's going on there. So here we're looking at, not this quarter, but actually Q1, the global demand for action-adventure original series. Now, I want to show how this looked in Q1 because you'll see that Netflix and Disney Plus were basically neck and neck, tied for the top spot here, both with about 30% demand share. Q1 was when Netflix really entered hyperdrive, starting to roll out its new Marvel series. And that's what led it to grow to a 30% share in Q1. But if we look at how things stack up this quarter, we see how it's paid off for Disney Plus. They've jumped into first place. They have 34.2% demand share for action adventure originals. And that's really due to huge demand for its new Marvel series. Important to note, if you look at Netflix, its share has held steady. It's basically the same share it was in Q1. So Netflix is holding up well in the face of increased competition from Disney Plus. Again, important note, Amazon has actually grown its share. In Q1, it was 14.6% share here. Now it's 15.3%. So Netflix is succeeding and growing in the face of increased competition. What does this mean? This means that Disney's growing demand share has really come at the expense of HBO Max and Paramount Plus in the action adventure space. Why is this? In the action adventure genre, particularly, HBO Max and Paramount Plus are relying on two major franchises. Of course, HBO Max has the DC Universe shows, think Titans, Doom Patrol, Swamp Thing. Paramount Plus, of course, that's Star Trek. And there were no new premieres in these franchises in Q2. So you really see their demand share taking hit because of that. And personally, I love this next chart, and there are plenty of them in the report. This is really the same data we were just looking at. So share of demand for digital originals by original platform, specifically the action adventure genre. The reason I love these is you can see all the changes happening month to month across the past 2 years in a way that you can't with a simple pie chart. And the action adventure space in particular has really undergone some major changes. So you can see here, of course, Disney Plus has had an amazing run up in its demand share. And that was starting with The Mandalorian season 2 in October of 2020. That's really what kicked it all off. It's been a great run since then. And of course, their new Marvel series, WandaVision, Falcon and Winter Soldier, now Loki. And I know there's been this narrative of Disney Plus being this unstoppable force, growing aggressively. And that's true, we're seeing that, but I did want to add a few points to paint a more nuanced picture. So first, if we look at Disney Plus's share of demand for action adventure series, we see it actually peaked in April at the beginning of the quarter at 36.7% share. So Disney Plus's demand share has really run up against some competition, some pushback, has hit a peak there and is off its highs in the remaining months of the quarter. Next, I just want to look back at Disney Plus's original premiere. So in November of 2019, Disney Plus launched, and they were able to carve out an over 28% share of demand in the action adventure space in that first month. So looking at its demand share in December, that's really due to high demand for The Mandalorian season 1. But important to note, if you look at the peak it achieved in December 2019, it took 14 months to regain that ground. And so I think this is a great example of how The Mandalorian season 1 shows that a high in-demand show can make a big splash, but if you don't have a steady stream of in-demand content following up on it, it's not necessarily sustainable. So we see that happening with Disney Plus here. Mandalorian making a huge splash, probably achieving what Disney Plus had wanted to achieve, certainly attracting viewers, getting attention, but without more series following up on it that are in demand, we really see a drop off there, and took 14 months to regain that ground. And I always like to point this out. So if you look at that gray area, that's demand for action adventure originals coming from other platforms that we haven't broken out here. 2 years ago, the majority of that other demand was coming from DC Universe originals. Now, of course, DC Universe is no longer around. It's been discontinued, but it's so impressive to me thinking back that 2 years ago, DC Universe was the main competitor to Netflix in this space, giving Netflix a run for its money, In some countries, we even see it having the largest share of demand for original action-adventure series 2 years ago. But it's a bit of a ghost of streamers past. I think DC Universe is a reminder that no platform should be too comfortable with their advantage, and no platform success is written in stone. So just keep that in mind. So next, we're looking at the most in-demand new series premieres in Q2. And I always like to highlight these because when you're looking at the top shows in the markets in this report, many times they're not brand new series. They've been around for a while. They have existing fan bases. People are excited for their returning seasons. So it's always nice to highlight the shows that have been successful from the beginning because that's a unique challenge. And of course, here we see Loki topping the rankings as the quarter's most globally in-demand new series premiere, with 77.3 times the average series demand in its first 30 days. And that's really far above any of the other series we've seen premiere. But to give it a little context, if you compare how Loki's done with WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier, it's actually lagging its predecessors. So both Falcon and the Winter Soldier and WandaVision were over 80 times the average series demand. So I think this is just another indicator that the Disney Plus Marvel machine might be losing a bit of steam. One more thing I wanted to call out with these series, 9 of 10 of them are based on existing IP. So Solos from Amazon Prime Video being the only one that's not based on something else, whether that's being part of a universe like Loki is with the Marvel Universe, being based on a book like Shadow and Bone, a comic like Sweet Tooth, Jupiter's Legacy. Being based on existing IP is really a leg up when you're premiering a new show. You have those pre-existing fans. It's tested material. So if you're able to succeed without being based on intellectual property, that's all the more impressive. And one final thing to call out in this chart, Jupiter's Legacy, if you look at that, that was the 6th most in-demand digital original premiere this quarter, just over 20 times the average series demand in its first 30 days. That trailed some of the other Netflix premieres, so Shadow and Bone, Sweet Tooth, Sex Life all came out ahead of it. Important to note, I think Shadow and Bone, Sweet Tooth, and Sex Life all were renewed for their season 2. Jupiter's Legacy was pretty quickly canceled. So I think we see it disappointing there and not getting renewal as a result. And I might be getting a bit ahead of myself with this, but this was a recent development and we had a few questions come in about this show in particular. So Squid Game did not premiere in Q2, but when we look at how its first 30 days stacks up against the top premieres of Q2 that we just saw, it comes out ahead. So Squid Game had 84.4 times the average series demand in its first 30 days. So that's ahead of even Loki. And what makes this all the more impressive, as I was mentioning, Squid Game is not based on existing IP. It's not part of a universe like Loki is. It really came out of the blue. So like that fact makes its successful premiere all the more impressive. I think it caught everyone by surprise. So well done, Squid Game. And this next chart may be a bit off topic, but it was one of my favorite insights from the past quarter, so I want to share it. So what are we looking at here? This chart shows the average demand for shows that received 5 or more major Emmy nominations over the past 5 years. And we see a pretty consistent trend in growing demand for shows that are getting Emmy nominations. In particular, there's been a big jump in demand this year. So what's that number mean? That means that of shows that received 5 or more major Emmy nominations, the average demand for them during the Emmy eligibility period was 18.7 times the average series demand. Now, what does this mean? This means that shows getting recognition with Emmy nominations are tending to be those audiences want the most. And it's been trending in the right direction. So this is relevant because I know award shows like the Emmys have taken a lot of criticism for being out of touch. But this result shows that they're moving in the right direction, at least. So yeah, one of my favorite findings from the quarter. Now we're going to get into some of the country-specific findings. And personally, I think these are some of the most interesting insights. This is where you get those market-specific idiosyncrasies. when you look at everything from a global level, you tend to lose out some of the nuance. So I had a lot of fun picking these out. We're going to focus on what makes 5 of the markets covered in the report unique, look at shows that have succeeded in them. So let's get into it. All right, first off, the United States. And this is a good high-level overview of what's going on in the US in terms of digital original demand share this quarter. At the top, we see share of original demand by platform. Again, Netflix coming in first place with 46% demand share. This is below where it was globally. And it's worth mentioning that Netflix has been below 50% share in the US for a while now, whereas globally, this was the first quarter it's fallen below that threshold. And that's because demand for content from these other platforms accounts for a higher share of demand in the US. Now, if you look at the bottom left, I like this chart because it really sums up how things have shifted quarter to quarter. So we see Netflix demand share was down 4% from where it was in Q1. Just a reminder that 4% is a 4% change in demand share, not 4 percentage points of its demand share lost. So keep that in mind. But yeah, Netflix declining a bit. Of course, no surprise, Disney Plus is the big winner this quarter, up almost 16% from where it was. We see HBO Max and Apple TV Plus, strong growth there. Again, like we've noted globally, Amazon Prime Video also seeing growth. The biggest loser this quarter was Paramount Plus, down over 10%. And like I mentioned, that's because no new highly in demand Star Trek content this quarter, Q2. So you're really seeing its demand share take a hit because of that. Now, what surprised me in this was Hulu lost demand share this quarter. And I would not have expected that because, like I mentioned, we know that The Handmaid's Tale Season 4 premiered in Q2, released episodes weekly throughout the quarter. And that's really one of Hulu's flagship originals. So I think knowing that, you would expect it to give Hulu's demand share a boost. And we actually don't see that playing out. So I think this is an indicator that this show in particular doesn't have the same power to draw audiences in that it once did. And I'll mention, if you follow the Emmys, you'll probably know that it set a record this year. Not an enviable record necessarily, but a record for the most losses. I think it got 21 nominations and won 0 of those categories. So again, maybe The Handmaid's Tale is an example of the Emmys lining up with audience demand. And at the bottom right, this is just one show, but it's a good example of some of my favorite insights coming out of this report, pinpointing specific shows and looking at where they succeed compared to how they do globally, where they're not so successful, and trying to pick apart why that is. So here we have an example, Ted Lasso, ranked number 29 globally in Q2, but does much better in the US, ranked 12th, similar in Australia, ranked number 15, does not catch audience's attention as much in Germany and especially Peru. So I'll have a few more insights like that, looking at particular shows and why they succeed. All right, so changing gears a bit. Here we're looking at the share of demand for digital originals in the US by genre. So we see this pretty consistently every quarter, but drama has the smallest share of digital original demand in the US compared to other markets. And that's really because we have content from all of these other genres succeeding in the US. So if you look at comedy, children's content, reality, documentary genres, these all have a larger share of demand in the US than any other market we look at. So I particularly wanted to focus on docuseries in this presentation because there we see there's a trend of continued growth. We've seen it for multiple quarters. In 2020, digital original documentaries accounted for 9% of digital 9% demand in the US. So that was actually more than double what it was in 2019. So huge growth year on year there. In Q1, we saw that this documentary's share of demand in the US was 9.9%, another quarter of growth, and here it's 10.5%. So continued growth in the documentary genre. And here we're looking at the most in-demand subgenres for digital originals in the US. So I love this chart in the US because it really looks like a rainbow, and that's because there's so much variety for the subgenres that are catching audience's attention in the US. We see at the top, sci-fi drama was the most in-demand subgenre for the quarter. Think back to Stranger Things, that was the most in-demand original in the US this quarter. But superhero series close behind, just 1% less demand than sci-fi drama this quarter. So a tight race between those two. We see 2 comedy subgenres, comedy drama, sitcom, 2 children's genres, cartoons, and school-age content. And coming in at number 10 is true crime. Now, this is important. The US was the only market in this report where a documentary subgenre made it into the top 10. So that really shows strong demand in this market for documentaries, and in particular, true crime. So this chart is looking at the top most in demand documentary subgenres and how they've shifted year on year. So true crime has consistently been the most in demand documentary subgenre, but we see from 2019 to 2020 to 2020, 2021, demand for true crime has grown 60%. We see demand for all of these documentary subgenres growing year on year, but true crime in particular has had strong growth. So that's really driving some of the top level growth we're seeing in the documentary genre. I also love this chart because it just reminds you the variety of different types of documentary content there is. So true crime, science documentary, historical documentary, social documentary, nature, sports, these are all very different. There's such a variety of content in the documentary genre. Just a good reminder. In this next show, again, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The show premiered in August, but I think it's really relevant to this trend we're seeing. So Only Murders in the Building. If you know anything about it, it is not a true crime documentary. What it is a comedy about a true crime podcast. And it's actually been one of the most in-demand premieres of the year so far, I can tell you that. It had 27.2 times the average series demand in its first 30 days. So it's been incredibly successful. And I think it's just a great example of how you can creatively incorporate elements into a show that are highly in demand. In this case, true crime. So it can incorporate that true crime element that that catches audiences' attention without being a true crime documentary per se. All right, next up, we have Peru. And Peru is a great example of a country that has a really clear market preference that comes through in the data. I'll show you what I mean. So again, looking at share of demand in Peru by genre, we see action adventure content has a 29.1% share of demand. That's higher than any other market we looked at. It's also more than twice the global share of demand for this genre, which is 14%. So huge demand in Peru for action adventure content. What's driving that in particular? It's high demand for superhero series. So superhero series is the top most in demand digital original subgenre for the quarter in Peru by a long shot. This is actually the biggest gap between the top ranked subgenre and the second ranked subgenre, sci-fi drama. So more than a 60% difference in demand here. I will mention though that it isn't totally superhero series driving high demand for action adventure content. We also see sci-fi action here in Peru ranks higher than in any of the other markets. And action fantasy does better here than it does globally. So 3 very different flavors of action content succeeding in Peru, but primarily high demand in Peru is being driven by superhero series. And one show in particular stood out in Peru, that's Titans. So this is well in many markets around the world. We already saw that WandaVision was the #1 most in-demand digital original series in Peru for the quarter. And many of Disney Plus's superhero series did well in Peru this quarter, but Titans stood apart as being uniquely successful in Peru compared to other markets. So you can see it was the second most in-demand digital original in Peru compared to its rank globally, 32, and compared to its rank in other markets. So I think this is just good news for HBO Max launching in Latin America. It shows that they have assets like Titans that are highly in demand in the region. So good indicator for success. And now we have Japan. So Japan's interesting. The demand landscape in Japan is totally different from any of the other markets we looked at. Why is that? That's really because animated content has such a high share of demand among digital originals in Japan. So if you look at it here, accounts for almost 25% of demand for digital originals in this quarter in Japan. That's huge. We don't see this large a share of demand for animated content in any other market. And when you compare it to animated content's share of demand globally, that's 6%. So it's much larger than that. And what's driving that? This is probably not necessarily a surprise, but it's really high demand for anime. We see that is the top ranked subgenre this quarter. More than twice the demand of the second ranked subgenre superhero series. So a really huge demand in Japan for anime. But it isn't 100% anime. We also see animated comedy in Japan ranks higher than it does in any other market. So a general love of animated content, but anime specifically is driving the huge share of demand for animated content in Japan. Now, I think that raises the question, if animated content is so successful in Japan, what content has suffered because of this? And what types of content has succeeded despite the overwhelming demand for animation? So if we look at the share of demand for different genres in Japan, we see drama, children's, comedy, and even horror have a much lower share of demand in this market than they do globally. And that's really because animation is eating into those demand shares. But when you think about what anime can do, anime can be drama. It can scratch that comedy itch that a viewer might have. Many anime series are more geared towards children, so something more along the lines of cartoons and even horror content. It can sort of exist in that space. So it makes sense that high demand for anime is eating into these genres where there can be overlap with it. Now, when you think of the genre that anime can't replace, reality seems to be that. It's really the furthest thing from anime, and we see that the reality genre does succeed in Japan. So a 4.6% share of demand in Japan, that's much larger than its global share of demand for reality content, 2.7%. And in this report, the share of demand for reality content was larger in only the US. And we know that the US market has exceptionally high demand for reality content. So reality succeeding in Japan despite the dominance of animation here. And here we have a few examples of the top ranked digital original reality series that are catching audience attention in Japan. And I love these examples because they just, again, show the breadth of content in the reality genre. So first up, we have Terrace House, that ranked number 7 this quarter. That's your typical housemates reality, people living together, dating in a house. Next, Documental. And I'll be honest, I did not know the premise of this show before looking into it, but it's basically 10 comedians are stuck in a room together. They try to make each other laugh, and the last one remaining that isn't laughing wins a prize. So something pretty interesting there. And finally, another competition reality, but totally different from comedians trying to make each other laugh. We have BattleBots Bounty Hunters. So that's a spin-off of the original BattleBots series, and this is on Discovery Plus. Does very well in Japan compared to how it does globally. The premise of this show is teams are building robots that they put in head-to-head battle, trying to destroy one another. Again, competing for a prize at the end. So three very different flavors of reality content that is succeeding in Japan. Next up, we're going to be looking at Germany, and I thought this was an interesting counterpoint to what we saw in Japan. So I flagged Germany as potentially the next anime hotspot. I'll show you what I mean. So this is an insight I reached from the bottom up, you might say. Initially, I noticed this one show doing very well in Germany for the quarter, Trees. So here we're looking at demand for Trees in its first 30 days around the world. And we see Germany ranks number 2. The Philippines is the top market for this show. So if you know anything about this series, it is an anime series based on a comic from the Philippines based on Filipino mythology that is set in Manila. So knowing that, it does make sense that the Philippines was the market with the highest demand for this show, 25 times the average series demand. But it's not necessarily obvious why this show is succeeding in Germany. So I thought I would do a little bit more digging. And when we look at the top markets with the highest demand for anime and how that's grown over the past year, we see that Germany's actually come out on top in terms of growth and demand for anime. In fact, the European markets in general here, so we have Germany, France, Russia, the UK, they've all seen the most growth over the past year in terms of their demand for anime content. Japan and the Philippines, those two markets grew the least, but it's important to note that these are already some of the most anime-loving markets, so there's less room to grow for them. So high growth and demand for anime content in European markets, in particular, Germany coming out on top. So knowing that, I went back and looked at other series that were succeeding in Germany the past quarter. And among others, this show, Yusuke, stood out. So again, this is demand for Yusuke in its first 30 days. We see Germany is the market with the highest demand for this show, 8.5 times the average series demand in Germany. One other interesting thing about this show in particular, if you look at the top 10 markets in terms of demand for this series, we see two African markets, South Africa and Kenya, have high demand for this show. That was unique, and if you know a little about the premise of the show, that helps explain why. So Yusuke is actually based on a historical character who was an African warrior who came to Japan and became a samurai in the 16th century. So knowing that, maybe it makes it a little easier to understand the high demand for the show in these African markets. And I think this is a important learning for anime content in general about how it can successfully export to the world. Similar to Treese, adapting that Filipino comic, find stories that resonate with local audiences and adapt those, and you should find fans in markets around the world. And finally, we have Russia. Now, Russia was the most drama-loving market in this report. And we see that at a top level here. So more than half of demand for digital original series in Russia was for a drama series. 55.5% of demand in Russia was for drama. That's the largest share in this report, also well above the global average share of demand for drama, 48%. Similar story with horror, the 3.8% share of demand for horror in Russia, highest of markets in this report and above the global average. Now, of course, horror is a much smaller, more niche genre, so nowhere near the scale of drama, but still a distinct market preference for horror in Russia. And next, we're going to look at these again are the top subgenres for the quarter in Russia. So it gives you a bit of a sense of what types of drama are succeeding in Russia. So again, sci-fi drama is the top ranked subgenre. If you remember back to that first map we shared, Stranger Things was the most in-demand digital original in Russia for the quarter. That's a sci-fi drama, so we see that market preference coming through here. But two types of drama in particular stand out and make Russia unique. So historical drama ranks higher in Russia than in any other market, and fantasy drama does much better here than it does globally. So those types of drama are in particular catching audiences' demand in Russia. So next we're going to look at a few particular shows and try to understand what's made them successful in the Russian market. So first up, we have The Great. If you know anything about the show, it is a historical drama, but specifically it is a historical drama about the Russian Empress Catherine the Great's rise to power. So I think those two elements, historical drama, which we know already succeeds in Russia, plus a Russian story, Catherine the Great, make this show a success in this market. So we see it's ranked 71 in Russia, but only 146 globally. So ranks much more highly in Russia than it does globally. And side note, if you haven't seen the show, I highly recommend. It's pretty quirky, very unique, funny, but still a historical drama, so you still learn something. So enjoyed it, and I think season 2 is coming out next month, so watch for that. This next show, I think, is a good example of how genre-bending shows can find success in a market where you might not normally think they would be successful. So we saw in Russia, comedies have fared worse than other types of content, much smaller share of demand, and comedies tended not to rank very highly in Russia. This is an example of a comedy that succeeded. So Why Women Kill ranked 22 in Russia for the quarter and globally ranked 49th. If you can't tell by the title, or the show image. This is not just a comedy, it's a dark comedy. So Why Women Kill was able to do better in Russia because it's incorporated some of those heavier drama-leaning themes that we've seen appeal to Russian audiences. So if you're going to make a comedy that's going to be successful in Russia, maybe introduce some darker elements to it, like this show. And finally, we have the show Marvel's Hellstrom. So similar to comedy, we saw that action adventure content in Russia had a lower share of demand than it did in many other markets than globally. And looking at the top shows for the quarter in Russia, it was not as dominated by superhero series. In particular, Disney Plus's new Marvel shows weren't ranking as highly in Russia. So it's interesting to understand what made this show in demand in Russia in particular. So it's part of the Marvel universe, Marvel's Hellstrom, and it's an action adventure show. Despite that, it ranks much higher in Russia than it does globally. Why is that? The show has strong horror elements. So again, we already saw that Russian audiences have high demand for horror. So it's a good example of how introducing elements like horror to a show can make it stand out in a market where you might not normally think it would be successful. And that's the end of what I have prepared for today. But I think we still do have some time for questions. I know people submit a lot of questions in advance. I really appreciate that. Those are always great to see. And I tried to touch on some of those throughout the presentation, so I hope I was able to answer some people's questions throughout the presentation. But let me just check and see what questions have come through. So just give me a minute, please. And it looks like Samuel's been doing a great job answering questions in the chat. So thank you, Samuel. I appreciate that. I do have a few other questions that came through in advance that I'll touch on. So we had a number of questions come through about specific markets, and we only had time to touch on 5 specific markets today. There are 11 specific markets in the report. So if we didn't get to your market of interest today, it may be in the report. We mix it up every quarter, so hopefully it's in another report. But we had 2 questions come in. First, someone asked about UK demand trends. Now, the UK was not one of the markets we covered in this quarter's report. But luckily, we have recently done a report on demand in European markets, and the UK was covered in that. If anyone was at MIPCOM, you may have seen our white paper there. It is available on Demand 360 Lite. So that's a deep dive into, I believe, 6 different European markets, the UK being one of those. So I can share some insights about the UK from that we've done recently. So in the UK, we see demand for documentary content doing very well. And in particular, locally produced documentary content in the UK exports very well to the world. So documentary is succeeding in the UK. And there was also a really interesting finding about the UK in particular. And this has to do with talent demand, which is a new metric that we've rolled out. So similar to demand for series, this measures demand for talent, whether that's actors, musicians, politicians, personalities, athletes, whatever. We can measure demand for individual talent and see how that does. So in the UK specifically, we looked at how demand for talent breaks down, specifically sports talent by sports type. And we saw that the UK has a significantly higher share of demand for soccer, football, depending on where you're at, soccer, football talent than other markets globally. So we really see soccer talent succeeding in the UK. And we included a really interesting case study about a particular show. So if anyone's heard of Amazon's All or Nothing series, but specifically All or Nothing Tottenham Hotspur. So that follows a British soccer team. So did well in the UK. High demand there, as you would expect. But looking into that show, demand for it popped in 2 markets that were pretty surprising. So they had very high demand in South Korea and also very high demand in Portugal. So digging into that a bit more, looking at the show, one of the players on Tottenham Hotspur is actually the captain of the South Korean soccer team. So that's a great example of how demand for him as an individual, his individual talent, drove demand in his home market for this show. And with Portugal, it wasn't a player, but it was actually the manager of the team in this season was from Portugal, and that was driving high demand in that market. So a great case study there. Check it out if you're on Demand 360. So yeah, those are just a few insights on demand for content in the UK. And we also had a question come through about Spanish language content. Specifically, someone asked if Spanish content is traveling to other Spanish-speaking markets or just staying local to where it is. Now, Spain was one of the markets we covered in this report, and I just didn't get a chance to include it in today's webinar, but Spain is always one of my favorite markets to cover. It's a market that's totally unique when you look at the share of demand by originating platform, because it has two local platforms that have carved out a significant share of demand in this market, in their home market, Spain. So Movistar Plus and A3 Player. Now, specifically with regards to Spanish content traveling as opposed to staying in its home market, I think these platform series are a good example of content traveling well outside of their home market. So when we look at demand share in Latin American countries, we actually see in many countries, Movistar's content, Movistar Plus the content has carved out a decent share of demand in these Latin American countries. So it is exporting well to other markets outside of Spain. And of course, think of, for example, La Casa de Papel. That's a great example. We've talked about that plenty, had some great presentations on that, but that's a great example of a show from Spain, originally broadcast there, picked up by Netflix, and has become a global hit. And I believe the most recent year of data we have for that, so looking at the top markets for La Casa de Papel, Spain is, I'm trying to think, I think Spain or the US is top for this. I can't quite remember, but I know that this year, India became the top market for La Casa de Papel. So we really see this content not just exporting well from its home market, but succeeding even better in countries abroad than at home. Let me see. Okay, so we just had a question come in from Sandra, thank you. Does demand for anime series vary between Japanese-made anime versus US or Europe-made anime? So we actually worked with, NPR did a podcast on this. They were looking at foreign-made anime, I believe, and we shared some data with them. I don't know off the top of my head how these stack up. We would have to like break it by market of origin, but I will say the vast majority of anime is still exporting from Japan. So it's not as if for anime to succeed in a market like the US, it has to be originating from the US. We definitely see some of the most in-demand series in general, not just among anime even, are Japanese-made anime. So yes, we see Japanese anime succeeding regardless of market, and it does make up the bulk of anime series in general. So I think we don't have any more questions. We're about at time. But before we wrap up, I just want to mention that we do have a 30% discount to our Demand 360 Lite product for all webinar attendees today. So if you want to see the full report that we've been talking about, it's on there, as well as all previous quarterly reports we've done, all the reports and white papers we put out, they're available on there. And that's just on top of getting data for over 17,000 shows in 46 different markets around the world. So really everyone. And it's not reflected in this page, but I've talked to the product team and they're going to be rolling out Talent Demand on Demand 360 Lite for no additional charge. So that's really exciting. I mentioned a few examples of Talent Demand. That's a really exciting new product. So it will be available on Demand 360 Lite. So check it out. You have a 30% discount. Thanks everyone so much for tuning in today. If you've come before, you know we do these every quarter. So I hope to see everyone at the next Parrot Analytics Live. Thank you. Have a good night. Have a good day wherever you are. Hope to see you again.